Oh, here's you. Today we did the Oh, did you?
Hello, everyone. Good evening. And it's a lovely night here in Tucson for the start of our Fall 2019 Science Café series, all about ocean science. It's good to see a lot of familiar faces and a lot of new faces. Can everybody hear me okay, even all the way in the back? Can you guys hear me all right? All right. I'm glad to see those hands waving. My name is Shepard Reed. I work at the Flandreau Science Center and Planetarium. If you haven't come to visit us lately, we've got a lot of great exhibits, including one that is kind of a good way to get into ocean science, which is our sharks exhibit. It's called Sharks, Magnificent and Misunderstood. A lot of great interactives. If you haven't come, please visit. Bring your kids, bring your grandkids, bring the extended family. It's a lot of fun. And we also have a show, that planetarium show that we brought in conjunction with the exhibit. It's called Great White Shark. It's about those magnificent creatures that we love to fear, but they got a bad reputation from all those Hollywood movies, and they're actually fascinating creatures. And this is a show that was made by divers who dive with the great whites. So that's an exciting planetarium show. If you haven't seen a show in our planetarium, it's amazing. We have what's called digital full-dome projection, so we have high-resolution video all around you. You feel like you're swimming with the sharks, so that's pretty cool. And I'm going to give one last shout-out here. Many of you have probably found our brochure for all the different, we have 5 different Science Cafe series going on in the greater Tucson region at this point. That's kind of amazing, and it shows that I think how much great science is happening at the University of Arizona, that we're able to support 5 different series around town. And Flandreau is part of the UA Science outreach sites. So a lot of you have heard this spiel before, but we collaborate with Biosphere 2 and the Mount Lemmon Sky Center and the Mirror Lab and the Tree Ring Lab and Tumamoc Hill, and those are all great places to learn about the science that has happened here in southern Arizona and the science that's going on now at the University of Arizona. So we hope that you'll get out and visit all those sites. And with that, now that I've done my plug for science outreach, I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Katrina Mangin. She is a lecturer in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. She is also the one who spearheads a wonderful program called Marine Discovery that we host at Flandreau that she can tell you about. And she leads trips to the Galapagos. She knows a lot about ocean science and the ecology of our oceans. Please give a warm round of applause for Dr. Katrina Mangin.
Thank you, Shepard. So make sure I'm standing in the right place here. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about these different topics. So why should we care about the ocean? Why does it matter? Some of my favorite critters in the ocean, climate change and the effects on the ocean, and then a little bit about my research story in my favorite ecosystem in the Sea of Cortez in the Gulf of California. So first, to just remind you about the ocean, so this covers 71% of our planet, and when you consider how deep it is, up to 7 miles at its deepest, 2 miles on average deep, that area of 71% of the planet times how deep it is, it's really over 99% of the living biosphere, given that the ocean, all the water in the ocean has living stuff in it, whereas the land has about maybe 1,000 feet maximum of air above it with organisms in it. Anyway, so as I'm talking about the importance of the ocean, think of it as on this grand scale. It really is 99% of the biosphere. So the first thing is that ocean moderates our climate. By taking heat from the tropics to the poles, it makes the tropics less warm. So you look at this orange current, it's going from the tropics to the poles, and water gets really salty and cold up there, and then it sinks, and it goes down, and it circulates around the whole ocean. It takes about 1,000 years for a drop of water to make this whole circuit. But it does moderate our climate. And then the other thing about the ocean is that it's really a soup of organisms. So if you imagine you're a scuba diver, you're on a bicycle trying to bicycle through the water, it takes a lot of effort. It's really dense. And that density means it supports all of this life, both nutrients and the life that lives on those nutrients. So here's a picture of all these plankton. Some of them are one-celled, some of them are small, microscopic animals. And this is the base of the food chain in the ocean. And it's really the biggest food chain on the planet, again, considering this is 99% of our biosphere. So it offers a lot of things. I'll talk more about those. This is really hard to see. But what this is this is a picture of probably the most important organism ever on Earth. And what it is called Prochlorococcus, and it's a cyanobacteria. So it's a one-cell bacteria that photosynthesizes. And right now, it's the most common organism on the planet. So I can see the next one. So what this shows you, it says the sea's invisible pastures. So if you look out on the sea, it looks like this blue ocean. But there's all of this photosynthesis going on inside of it. I don't know that you can see this, but it's color-coded for these different main 4 microorganisms photosynthesized in the ocean. And a massive amount of this is just green from that one organism, Prochlorococcus, which is super abundant, photosynthesizing like crazy. And the more we study it, the more it's doing all these weird things, like it's buds off little blebs of DNA and RNA to float around in the water for reasons nobody knows. But anyway, really important for photosynthesis. So altogether, this phytoplankton in the ocean, like Prochlorococcus, for the streetcar, it's up to 50% of the oxygen that we breathe, maybe more, comes from the ocean. Next one. So now I'm going to go back in time. This is soon after the formation of the Earth. It's just a hellish place. You couldn't breathe. There's no oxygen, all of this toxic gases. There's a moon in there. The moon has formed. It's all orphaned off of the Earth by now. You can see the next slide. And then you get these early oceans, which actually developed relatively quickly. And there you can see this huge moon with these massive tides because the moon was closer. But still no life, no oxygen, no life in the ocean. And then you get these fossils showing up, 3.5 billion years. So considering that the Earth is only 4.5 billion years old, life actually appeared pretty early. This is fairly advanced life, so it probably occurred even earlier. But anyways, this is when you see these fossil cyanobacteria, and they look remarkably like modern day cyanobacteria. So now we're going forward a bit more in time. Now these cyanobacteria, this is Earth, still not that much life, but a lot of cyanobacteria. They're making these mounds in the water called stromatolites. So they live in these really cool structures filled with sediment and cyanobacteria cells. And now they're starting to photosynthesize like crazy, getting more and more abundant in the ocean. Okay, next one. And this is just to show you that you can actually go to Shark Bay, Australia, which I've never done and I'd always wanted to. Has anybody here been to Shark Bay? Okay, very cool. And you can see these living stromatolites. There's also a few off the coast of Baja, in the Gulf of California. But this is a major place to see. So this is the only graph I'm showing you tonight, but just to go through this, I want to make this point about oxygen. So here on this axis, this is the percentage of oxygen in the atmosphere. And this is going through time from soon after the formation of the Earth. When you start getting life forms, you get the cyanobacteria. And the main thing I want you to notice is how long it took for oxygen to start accumulating in the atmosphere. The cyanobacteria was there and making all of this oxygen, but it took billions of years to get to the point where it even started to be very noticeable. And basically all of that time to get to the point is that today of 21%. And the reason is that oxygen was rusting out the ocean for billions of years. There's all this dissolved iron in the ocean, and it was being rusted out by this oxygen and then precipitating out as iron ore, which is all of the iron that we have today. It all came from this process of photosynthesis. But the other point I wanted to make is that we are breathing this ancient oxygen that accumulated over billions of years from these organisms. It's still in our atmosphere, and that's some of what we're breathing today. So the other thing that's really important about the ocean for people is that it produces food for animals and people. And it's about 1% of all the food that we produce is from the ocean. But it's high in protein. So relative to a lot of other foods, it's a major protein source for many people. And for people who live in small coastal nations that often are very poor, this is their main source of protein. So seafood is a resource really important in the ocean, and really important that we protect it. We are overfishing like crazy. So a study was done and estimated. They looked at fishing records from oceans all over the world, and they determined that 90% of the large predatory fish have been removed from the ocean. There's only about 10% left. And so we really mismanaged these fisheries. The U.S. is kind of probably the best managed fishery place in the world, but there's still a lot of progress to be made. So I wanted to mention another thing about fishing. As the fish from the shallow water, from the open water, surface waters have gotten more rare, fishing has really increased in the deep sea. And one example is the orange roughy. Has anyone ever heard of that here? So it used to be super common in the supermarkets. Now it's still there. It's not as common. But it lives on these things called seamounts. So these deep sea mountains. You can see one here. They're really productive. They've got all of these nutrients that come up and furnish them with lots of life. They're filled with deep water corals, lots of fishes. But the problem with fishing these areas is that, first of all, it destroys the mountaintop, and there's no one there to see it, to regulate what happens there. And the other thing is these fish are slow growing and really old. So one orange roughy can be up to 150 years old. It doesn't start reproducing until it's 20 years old. So these really are fisheries we either shouldn't fish or fish very carefully. So another thing about the ocean and what we get from the ocean is certain human-made materials, and it's called bioinspiration. When you take these natural materials and figure out ways that we can reproduce them for human use, a lot of drugs come from marine organisms. These organisms, like sponges and corals, they just blanket the rocks in the intertidal zone and the shallow seas. They are fighting for space like crazy, and they do it by secreting all these chemicals. They're trying to sort of burn each other to death at the edges. And so these are really strong anti-growth chemicals. They're trying to keep things from growing. And they're also antibacterial because they're just sitting there and things try to grow on them and cause disease. So powerful anti-cancer drugs, antibacterial, all kinds of drugs have come from these organisms. And the other is from shells. So if I show me the next slide. So the shell of a mollusk, of a snail or a clam, is really a remarkable thing. It's constructed with these series of tiles made out of calcium carbonate. They're overlapping tiles, and they have layers of a protein in between. So it ends up with this material that's both strong and tough. So when you think of something like a porcelain cup, it's very strong, it's really hard, but if you drop it, it shatters, so it's not very tough. Something like a leather belt would be really tough, but not very hard. But anyways, these mollusk shells have both of these properties. So they've been reproduced on an industrial scale, and they've made this material called alumina, which is the strongest ceramic known, 4 times stronger than bone, and it's used in hip replacement and other instances like that. So here's a snail, which was discovered fairly recently, that has a shell made of iron. So snails just take in whatever they can get, materials that are in the water where they live. But this particular snail lives deep in the sea, these things called black smokers, where there's all this volcanic material building up filled with minerals. And deposited around those smokers are copper, gold, bronze, these various metals And so this snail lives there at the base of these smokers, and so that's what it's using to make its iron shell. It also has all these iron plates on its body, and one theory is that they're to protect it from the harpoons of other snails. Snails like to harpoon each other. So the other thing about the ocean is the remarkable ecosystems that you see there. These are some of the most diverse ecosystems and some of the most productive in terms of the amount of plant material they're producing. And one is the kelp forest. So Charles Darwin wrote a lot about kelp forests. And he wrote, "Yet if in any country a forest was destroyed, I do not believe nearly so many species of animals would perish as would here from the destruction of the kelp." So this is a habitat that rivals the diversity of rainforest. So really important habitat. And the other is coral reefs. Again, so in these coral reefs, you see diversity on the scale of something like a tropical rainforest. And all of these really cool interactions that are going on, as well as a super high species diversity. It's estimated that 25% of the animal species in the ocean depend upon coral reefs for shelter or food, even though they're only 1%, cover 1% of the area of the ocean. So now I want to talk about some really cool animals. There's so many, and I'm actually leaving out dolphins and porpoises and manatees and really cool things. But talk about some of the little guys. So these are sea slugs, or nudibranchs, which means naked gills, because their gills are exposed. They have no shell or a small internal shell. And what they do is it's called kleptopredation. They steal components of their prey and use it to their own benefit. So for example, with this one, it eats hydroids. Hydroids are like jellyfish. They have stinging cells. So it eats the hydroids, but it doesn't digest the stinging cells of the hydroids. It puts them into these projections. And then it uses them to protect itself against its own predators. And then when they wear out, it just eats more hydroids and gets more of them. And this sea slug over here, it's called the solar-powered sea slug. It eats algae, and it takes the chloroplast out of the algae and puts it into its own body. So it's green like that because it's photosynthesizing, getting sugars from those chloroplasts. And an interesting thing about that sea slug is that some of the genes for photosynthesis are actually in the slug. They've been transferred from the algae into the slug. So the slug and the chloroplasts in its skin have to work together to photosynthesize. And these slugs are filled with viruses, for reasons no one really quite understands. But the viruses may have helped transfer those genes from the algae to the genome of the slug. So I love this eye. I love cephalopods. So these really cool animals like cuttlefish and octopus. So I'm going to show you this short video. Mimic. You can see it.
Unknown until it was spotted, first by fishermen off the coast of Indonesia in the 1990s. It looked like an octopus, but it could morph its shape in an instant to appear as seemingly any animal around it. At first, no one had any idea what it was.
The first time I saw it, I just was blown away. You couldn't get a more spectacular animal. It really is the pinnacle of wizardry.
Biologist Mark Norman was the first scientist to study this seemingly shapeless creature. He named it the mimic octopus.
The mimic octopus makes itself look like a living, moving animal. So it pulls all its arms around behind its body and swims along like a poisonous flatfish called a banded sole. In other cases, if it's getting attacked, it puts 6 arms down a hole and raises the other 2 arms to look like a poisonous sea snake that has bands along its body. If that's not enough, it'll swim along looking like a poisonous lionfish with these banded arms looking like the banded spines that come off these very deadly fish.
So far, 15 separate species are known to be in the mimic octopus act, and Norman is not always sure exactly what the mimic is doing. He observed this mimic scuttling along the sea bottom, looking something like a furry turkey with human legs.
sometimes it's hard when you watch a mimic octopus doing what it does to interpret what's going on. It's a bit like looking at ink spots in a psychiatrist's office going, I don't know what that is, it could be a piano, it could be a fridge. So you get 3 or 4 divers together and you'll argue all night trying to work out what we think it was mimicking.
Where did nature's greatest actor come from?
So one of the things this indicates is the intelligence of cephalopods. Somehow they're
Unknown
gauging.
until it was spotted, first by fishermen.
They're gauging what disguise to use under what conditions. So really interesting animals. So this is a boxing crab. These crabs hold anemones with stinging cells on their claws, and as they move along, they sort of box them like this, trying to keep predators away. And when they molt, they have to transfer those to their new shell, and they fight ferociously over these anemones. One crab will come along and try to get the other ones. This is a deep sea anglerfish, and anglerfish, like many animals that live in the really deep sea, are hermaphrodites, basically hermaphrodites. This is really common in the deep sea because there's little food down there, so populations are really small, and it's very hard to find a mate. So either they're hermaphrodite, or in the case of the anglerfish, the males are tiny compared to the female. And when they find the female, they're just really small little blobs. They bite into her body, anywhere along her body, and then their heads just fuse with her bloodstream, and they become these permanent parasites, but ready to give her sperm whenever she's ready to breed. And the other thing is they have these. Good idea if you're a deep sea anglerfish. And they also have these lures on their head to attract prey. And they have symbiotic bacteria that they grow in those lures that glow, that cause the glow. Just cycle through a couple, 3 times. And next one. One more. Okay, now keep going. And then the other, of course, are these big, spectacular animals like the great white shark. And there's a lot of research on these. They're really threatened species. Their numbers are so low. And researchers have been doing free diving with them to figure out things that they can't figure out when they have all the scuba tanks on. And also to sort of show how they don't immediately eat you. I agree with this thing that they aren't as vicious. Well, I don't know whether I really do. But that it's better if people didn't see them as these evil creatures, because they aren't evil creatures. But they are scary top predators. That's one of the things that's really cool about them. But you can dive with them like these free divers and not get eaten, just taken care of. So hopefully this will help advertise them as more popular and not something just to be killed. So there have been 5 major mass extinctions on Earth in the last 560 million years. This is one where there's just all this volcanic activity where 90% of all life went extinct, the end of the Permian. And this is the dinosaurs 66 million years ago, so in all of these cases it's climate change. It was the major component that caused these mass extinctions. And if you have the next slide, so the dinosaurs were the Earth was hit by an asteroid, triggered the massive climate change. And basically what we're doing now is equivalent almost to this asteroid hitting Earth. So we're in the midst of the 6th mass extinction, and it's causing a lot of problems. So I'm just going to briefly mention some of the consequences for climate change on marine organisms. One is that the ocean is becoming more acidic, and these animals, like these beautiful little sea butterflies, these are planktonic snails. They live their whole life with the plankton. Really important food for whales and other animals. And their shells are thinner than they used to be, and they have trouble making those shells in the first place. And there are heat waves in the ocean. With an increasing temperature of the atmosphere, the ocean itself is getting warmer. And some of you may have seen this in the news lately about the blob, or the return of the blob, because this blob has appeared a few times. And it's a heat wave. It's a blob of hot water, in this case, off the western coast of North America. So you can see in that diagram that red is just this unusually really warm water. And when these blobs happen, these masses of warm water, they have these consequences of coral bleaching, for one thing, when they're in tropical areas, and toxic algal blooms. So some plankton that normally are in low numbers become super abundant, and then they can kill fish, they can kill other organisms that eat them, and they cause fishery closures, both because of toxic shellfish and also because when fish become too rare, fisheries get closed. And this overall disruption of plankton trickles up the food chain, where organisms that depend on fish then don't have enough to eat, they have to travel farther than they usually do, and so you see orphaned sea lions and things like that along the coast of California and elsewhere. So here's a picture of coral bleaching. This happened in April in Tahiti and Moorea. So this is still going on. This place had not been bleached so much. Great Barrier Reef bleached, 50% of it has died now over 2 sequential bleaching events in 2016 and 2017. But what happens is that the coral spits out its symbiotic algae, and that algae is what gives it its food, and so then it bleaches and eventually it will die. So one thing I found helpful lately is this this wonderful young woman. She's Swedish, she's 16 years old, and she's this climate activist who's been really inspiring young people all over the world. And she just came to she arrived in the United States in August, and she's been organizing these Friday strikes of school children that are really all over the world. These are happening. So now I'm going to end with a little bit about the research that I've done in Rocky Point, sort of a story of discovery. So this is the northern Gulf of California. It's near the town of Choya Bay, which is right near Rocky Point. And I'm out here on this rock at low tide. Probably 6 hours later, there'll be about 20 feet of water in that spot. So really extreme tides. And this is all granite rock, and that brown is actually a sheet of barnacles, these little animals that are living all over the rock. You see the next one. And here are those same barnacles, but a few hours after the sun has been hitting them, it's dry, and you can see these spots on the rocks. So this was the pattern that I first noticed. And if you go over to the next slide. And here it's up even under some conditions of light. These spots are just so obvious. So a number of people had studied here before, graduate students studying the intertidal, and no one had ever noticed these. It seemed like it was a new phenomenon. And so I looked closely at these spots. Go back. Oops. Yeah, go forward one. And so here's one of the clearings. And I don't know whether you can see, but do you notice anything in the middle of that clearing? It looks like coal. It looks like a shiny piece of coal. It's about the size of a lentil. And it's kind of, in a way, it's a little flexible. It's a little pliable. So, but very dried out. So I didn't know what that was, but I decided, I was looking for a dissertation topic, and I decided to do an experiment. I was working with a friend, where we put out a big sheet of plastic, and we mapped out 20 of these clearings. We showed their edges. And in 10 of them, we dug out the little center black thing, and in the other 10, we left the black thing, and we just made a little dugout spot nearby. Then I kind of forgot about it, and a year later, I came back to see what was happening, put the piece of plastic down, and every place where I'd removed that little black spot, the clearing had completely filled in. It was gone, all barnacles. But wherever I'd left it, the clearing was identical. Even the edges, the shape of it was identical, completely unchanged. So I had no idea what this little black thing was. I called them LBUs, little black units. But I decided, I don't care, I'm going to do my dissertation on this, whatever it is. I'll figure it out. This is just such an extreme, strong effect of one organism on another. So I thought it was maybe an algae that was secreting a chemical that was killing everything around it. So I sent it to an algal specialist, and he said, no, this is not an algae. And then in the next slide, I finally collected it carefully enough to realize that it was an animal. I never thought it was an animal. It seemed too dried out. But it turns out that when you add salt water to this little black coal-like thing, this animal comes out, kind of like a Chinese paper flower, just folds out, It's a hydroid related to jellyfishes, anemones, and corals. Has these polyps, tentacles. So that's what this animal was. I couldn't find anything in any of the books. I couldn't figure out what species it was. It's really different than anything I could see. So next slide. The other thing is it can stretch out its tentacles. I found this out in the lab. And also while I was snorkeling, I could see that the tentacles just sort of whip around in all directions from this coal-like spot. And they seem to like completely, perfectly outline the outline of where the barnacles aren't. So on the next slide, I raised them in the lab so I could get their full life cycle so I could figure out what this is. Because I suspected it was something new at that point. So here's the adult, the LBU, and then here's its reproductive structures, and there are these medusa that it spins off. And the odd thing is that it makes those medusa, those little jellyfish-like things, but they only live for a few hours. They swim around, they release eggs and sperm, and they make a larvae, and then the cycle starts again. So I sent these to a specialist, a hydroid specialist in Belgium, and he said, this is a new species, it's actually a new genus, and it's very unusual because of this weird way it reproduces. It kind of makes medusae, but they only live for a few hours. So I got to name it, give it two names. So I called it samurai hydroid because it kills things with its barnacle, with its tentacles like a sword, and tabula rasa because it makes those clearings. And when it was reviewed, a Japanese scientist, a friend of mine, said, I really object to your calling it a samurai hydroid because the samurai were terrible people. They were plunderers and rapists, but I decided to call it the samurai hydroid. And I kept track of the numbers over time, and I also could super glue them wherever I wanted to, so I could see if I added them to an area, would they grow a clearing or keep barnacles away. And I also mapped them out on these sheets over time, many different sites. And here's an example of a map. And one thing is that you notice the little red spots or the clearing, the hydroids, and then those little purple circles are a snail called a limpet. And one of the things that these hydroids do is they provide home for these species of snail, limpets, that otherwise are really rare. They pretty much can't compete with the barnacles. So they're helping the limpets survive in this area. And you can see, they barely see them here, but they're these little tiny limpets, these little snails. They graze the clearing of algae, and then that provides more barnacles that settle in as babies in the clearings, and then that's more food for the hydroid. But the interesting thing about this whole story is it seems to be something new in this area. No one had ever noticed it before. It's just kind of like an invasive species, probably. But it fit in so well with the community. You would never think that it's not harmful in any way. It actually increases diversity by providing more habitat for this snail. So it was kind of an unexpected result. And as Shipard mentioned, I do just a couple more things of what I do. I do this course in the Galapagos Marine Ecology for high school teachers and for undergraduates. So if you want to know more about that, I can tell you. And then I run this marine discovery program where undergraduates teach children about marine biology during the visits to Flandreau Science Center. So that's it.
Well, thank you, Katrina. And for those of you who have been here before, you already know how this works. But for those of you who haven't been to a science cafe, this is the question and answer phase of the evening. And if you have a question, please raise your hand, and I will bring you the microphone so that everybody can hear the question that's being asked. I see a hand up already over there, and another one there. So I will get to the questioners in the order that I see the hands go up. So if a lot of hands go up, please be patient with me. I will get to you. And here we go. Are we ready? So I see the first question. Oh yes, there is one more video that we get to watch. Maybe that's a treat at the end of the evening. It is most remarkable. I got to see this, so you have to stay for the video.
So the clearings on the rocks.
Oh, yeah.
The clearings on the rocks, that's the biggest that they'll ever get. They won't get giant with these long tentacles going all over.
No, actually kind of a weird thing. The first year when we saw them, the clearings were really big. They were like this big. But then they were never that big ever again. And then, since then, they shrink and they grow. Some years seem to be better than other years, but otherwise, yeah, they don't get that big. And the whole hydroid doesn't get that big for some reason. Thanks.
And then we've got another one over here.
And my question is about the hydroids too. Have you seen them in other parts of the Gulf or only in?
I've seen them in, where did I see them? I've seen them in Central Gulf, in some places. I've seen them in San Carlos. But that's about it. I haven't seen them in between Peñasco and San Carlos. But they might be there by now. I bet they are.
All right, we've got another one right here.
I was just interested that this animal, I guess it's an animal, lives in the ocean when the tide is high, but just in the air then when the tide is low, every day going through that cycle. And are there a lot of animals like that?
There are a lot of animals like that, but it's very rare to get so dried out each tide. So some people who study cryobiology, freeze drying things forever, were really interested in this animal. And actually a number of companies were interested in this, like for keeping barnacles off of boats, for the cryobiology. But one of the things is it's not that abundant where it lives. And when I was first doing this, it was only known from Peñasco, and still that's the only place that's common. So these companies have to make a decision: is it worth their investment to try to look into something that's so rare? But that's a good point. That's a really weird thing that it can do.
I see a question over here.
How many species of hydroids are there?
That is a good question. I'm not sure, but I would bet that there's like hundreds.
That's a lot.
A lot.
What would be a kind of a working definition of a hydroid?
A hydroid, well, it's a cnidarian, which is related to corals, anemones, and jellyfish. They all have a mouth surrounded by a ring of tentacles, and they all have stinging cells. So those are really characteristics.
Looking around, are there other questions? There's one right up front here.
I have 2 questions. First of all, I always love to hear how you got into science, so like childhood stuff, how did that happen? And then, given an unlimited budget, what would you study?
I always have been interested in biology, and actually in marine biology since I was a little kid. I've always liked the little things on the rocks. And but still I had this, getting to the point of actually getting my PhD. I did a lot of things before that. I had miscellaneous jobs. I changed my mind about things. I've never had this very erratic path, which is true, especially with a lot of women, actually, to my career as a scientist. But I've always loved science. I just am crazy about science, all kinds of science, not just marine, but I'm interested in general. What was your other question?
And then given an unlimited
Oh,
budget, what would you study?
I would like to know how to, but I don't know how I would use, it's not my field or anything, but how to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, some industrial way to do that. And I know that some young person will figure that out.
Plant a tree.
That is a good point. And I know Tucson is on a tree planting campaign, so everybody should plant trees. That helps.
That was the suggestion, if everybody didn't hear that, was to plant a tree to take the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. There's a second question over here.
So on the samurai hydroid, where are the stinging cells on the?
They're at the end of the tentacles, so those little projections at the end with all the balls on them, they're just packed with stinging cells. and many different types of stinging cells. It looks kind of like a medieval mace when you look at it under the microscope, all these spikes coming out.
And they sting the,
Well, that's a good question. Do they sting the barnacles? I was never able to figure out for sure that they sting the barnacles, that they even kill the barnacles. I just have abundant evidence that if there's a hydroid, the barnacles die, which is indirect, but I could never figure that one out.
Other questions? Wow, that might mean that I get to ask questions. So because I got to have a conversation with Katrina the other day, and she was talking, in the presentation we saw how for millions of years these microorganisms were photosynthesizing and producing oxygen, but the oxygen didn't build up in the atmosphere because it was bonding with the iron in the ocean, rusting the iron, and then sinking down to the bottom to create these layers of iron in the rock, which is what we mine today to get iron. Hopefully I got all that right. But she mentioned something to me that I thought was fascinating, so I have to ask a question about it, which is, it is one theory about how we might pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. Can you talk about that idea?
Right. There's this really controversial idea to fertilize the oceans, and to do it by adding iron, because iron is now very limiting in the oceans. And when it's added to the oceans, they bloom. It's just like the plankton go crazy and grow like crazy. So the idea is just to put a lot of iron into the ocean. The plankton will bloom, and they'll pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere in the process of photosynthesizing. And then many of those plankton would then die, just a natural death, and they would sink down to the bottom sediments of the ocean and be stored for a really long time. So it would be a way to store carbon in deep ocean sediments and potentially pull a lot of CO2 out of the atmosphere. But it's controversial because this is the largest food web on the planet, base of the food web, and do we really want to mess with it? Is that a risk that's worth taking? And with a lot of these geoengineering type solutions for climate change, others of which have been suggested, like put out huge mirrors that reflect the sun away and things like that, we might have to do so. We might get to the point where, yeah, it's worth the risk. We're just going to try some of these things. So that's what, yeah. Talked about. Whale poop is a really good source of iron. Which is kind of interesting.
We have another question back there, and I'm going to take his first because this will be your third.
This question is about the pattern you showed of the historic increase in oxygen concentration in the atmosphere, and the graph showed a peak, and then it dropped back down to the level we have now.
Right.
The question is, what caused it to drop after it did that?
I don't know. But there have been ups and downs of oxygen in the history of life, and I don't know what causes it. That doesn't mean that someone doesn't know, but I don't have the answer to that.
We'll have to investigate.
Yeah.
And here's another question.
Good question.
Last question, I promise. So the hydra has all those tentacles. Is the mouth in the middle of all those tentacles?
Yeah.
Or does each tentacle?
The mouth is in the middle of all those tentacles.
So
Yeah, they can like bring that tentacle in and eat something.
Did you see them eating when you had them?
Well, I at one point I was really fortunate. I would glue rocks out in the intertidal, wait till the barnacles settled on them, super glue a hydroid onto that rock, get a clearing, and then I would chip that rock with the barnacle and the hydroid and bring it back to the lab. And one time when I was looking at them under the microscope, the barnacles began releasing larvae. There were like all these little baby barnacles swimming all over the place. And I thought, oh, this is great. I can see if they eat the barnacles. And the baby barnacles just crawled all over those spiky tentacles. They were completely unaffected. But maybe when they're older and they're on the rocks, they can pull them off. But anyways, I've never seen them eat the barnacles. I've seen them eat brine shrimp. I would feed them baby brine shrimp.
The more we know, the more mysterious these creatures become. Other questions out there? All right, we've got two up here. Here we go.
Yeah, there's a solution about pulling the carbon dioxide.
Maybe a little closer to
Yeah,
the-
so the solution to pull carbon dioxide out of the oceans, about like putting the iron. Do we really understand the ocean systems to actually do that? Has anyone done the experiments?
Okay, yes, after someone suggested this,
Yeah, just to add that, so whenever
Yeah.
we actually see the ecological system, we see that in an isolation, but when we see ocean as a whole, many times the solutions don't work. So to add something.
right, well, after this was proposed, some enterprising company decided, we're just gonna go do that. We're gonna go try this out. We're gonna jump a bunch of iron into the ocean, and then we're gonna make a lot of money offering carbon offsets. People can hire us and we'll dump iron out there. So they went out off the coast of California somewhere and they dumped a bunch of iron, and it did cause a little mini plankton balloon. But they were shut down completely. You really aren't supposed to do that. And then laws got sort of tightened up about doing things, renegades like that. So it did work, and of course it would work, no question, it would work. But ultimately, whether it would cause massive plankton die-offs, as they got too abundant and they ran out of oxygen, and then, it's not really clear what might happen. No, at that tiny scale, it didn't do anything, didn't mess up anything.
With the important role that coral reefs play in the life of the marine system, what's the prognosis with all of the bleaching that's going on as the ocean warms? Is there hope we can save coral reefs?
Well, there's a lot of stuff being done trying to transplant coral reefs, taking algae from areas that are naturally very warm with coral, maybe taking the algae from those reefs and sort of seeding it at other reefs that don't have that unusually warm water usually. So there's a lot of things like that are being done. But they're on such a tiny scale. The scale that we as humans can do at putting out little pieces of coral is nothing compared to the vast ocean with larvae in it that just, settle wherever they want, grow. So I think really the main hope is if we figure out a way to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. I don't know what the other solutions are going to be. I mean, there are little places where there's a lot of cold water welling up in the ocean where the coral is still healthy. So one thing we know is that if we could just sort of save things now or stop things now, a lot of the ocean would come back. It would get reseeded from those pockets of healthy coral and healthy fisheries and everything.
All right, there's another question back here.
Hi, so you talked about cyanobacteria, and you talked about a lot of these small creatures that are the underpinnings of our ecological structure. But what do you feel is the biggest obstacle to getting society, I guess, as a whole, to care about these smaller creatures, which are really the underpinnings of the whole ecological structure?
That's a good question. I really don't know, except to tell people about the details and how cool they are when you know the details of how they live. I know that with the sea butterflies, with the pteropods, there was a Scripps institution years ago was really putting some effort into thinking, is there a way to make them like a poster child for global health, a way to make them really charismatic because they're sort of cute. But that's a real challenge. I don't know what the answer is.
We all have to work on that one together.
Good question.
Are there other hands going up? I see two in the back here. Here we go.
So if you have a recommendation for one thing, or if you have 5 things, whatever, that those of us here tonight can do, a behavioral change we can make, is it not using plastic? Is it voting for the right people? Is it donating all of our retirement funds to someone? What's a solution that we can act on starting tonight?
Well, I definitely think voting. is really important, because on an individual scale, it really is important to live as, you know, way you feel like it's ethical, but there's only so much each individual person can do to make a big difference. But I think voting in people who have, you know, who really takes the climate change seriously and want to try to come up with those solutions is a really important one. And being aware of what seafood you buy. There's these apps that you can get from both from NOAA and from the Monterey-based aquarium, where you can just look up, what seafood should I buy when I'm at the store? And it will tell you, is it okay to buy Alaskan halibut? So you look and see all the things that are out there. And also, if you are going to eat seafood caught by American fishermen. Because the American fisheries are so well regulated compared to other countries. And 90% of the seafood that we do eat in the U.S. is imported. And there's this problem that then it's called the transfer effect, where we eat shrimp from Indonesia or Thailand, but that shrimp has been caught in a very unsustainable way. So it's cheaper, it's tempting to buy it, but just to be more aware of what seafood you're buying and what you're eating. And again, if you are going to buy seafood, buy American caught seafood. So that's a couple things I can think of.
Thank you. We've got another question all the way in the back here.
You mentioned something about industry finding out about your research. How exactly do they go about that? And is that actually a benefit to the type of research that you're doing?
I think it could be. In my case, you know, they never decided to pursue it, but I think it's probably a way you can find out a lot more about the animal. People are interested in putting a lot of effort and research into it. And I suppose it's one more way that the ocean is seen as valuable if you get more of these natural products out of it that can only be found from natural systems.
Thank you. Other questions? Not right now seeing any other hands, so that means I get to ask another question. I know that you've been involved in taking classes to the Galapagos, I think for many years now, probably long enough to see changes in that ecosystem. Can you talk about what you've seen over time in the Galapagos that's you know, I think one of the most special ecosystems on Earth, and I know it attracts a lot of tourists and many people study it, but I'm curious to understand how you've seen that change over time.
Yeah, I've been going to the Galapagos since 2003, and it's not a cruise-based trip, it's a trip based on land. And I've definitely noticed a decline in a lot of the seabirds. There aren't as many seabirds. Sea lions aren't as abundant. So I've seen this phenomenon that's been studied, and it seems like a lot of it has to do not with people exploiting them or disturbing them, but they aren't getting enough to eat. Fisheries have been so overfished, the oceans are warmer, there's just not enough forage fish for those animals. So I've really noticed that. A lot of these things happen on such a long time cycle, it's possible that they'll come back. Some of this is a natural cycle. And one of the things that I've noticed, since it's land-based, when we used to work with the schools and the local kids, I've really seen a difference in people's attitudes. Young people in the Galapagos are so different from their parents. You know, their parents might be fishermen and really don't believe a lot of this environmental stuff, whereas the kids are rabid and environmentalists, and they're so want to protect things, and I don't know, it's really hopeful. It's very interesting to see that. So I've noticed that change.
That is encouraging. Do we have any last questions for our, sorry, thank you.
Yeah, so do you think ecotourism has actually created awareness or created more pollution?
What?
Ecotourism.
Ecotourism.
Yeah, to make people aware, it's a good idea to actually show animals and show around.
Right. Ecotourism, you know, it's great because it provides a livelihood for people who want to provide that kind of tourism. So it's really good to support those people. But there's just so many people in the world. It's a challenge to keep those people, eco-tourists, from being too abundant and having a bad effect. But I think it's balanced out by they're also more educated and they care more about the environment. So overall, I think it's a really good thing.
Any last questions out there? I guess I have one last question.
Okay.
And that is, I think just in following along and reading about the plight of our oceans, there are many articles that are extremely alarming and kind of dash a person's hopes for the future health of the oceans. But I also know that along the way, people are organizing and figuring out ways to make what we harvest sustainable, to reduce pollution in the oceans, and it's encouraging that the younger generation is very concerned about that. Do you have any particular success stories that you're familiar with where groups of people or communities mobilized to make a positive change for oceans or ocean ecosystems?
I'm not sure I can think of one right off the top of my head. But one thing I can think of is that there are these instances in the ocean where marine mammals have gotten down to extremely low numbers, like sea otters. California sea otter was down to 8 individuals or something. They thought they were extinct, the subspecies of the sea otter. And as people discovered it in the 1930s off of Big Sur, they saw 8 of them. And then they spread, and they were protected. And now there are thousands of them. And similar with the northern elephant seal, the gray whale. So the marine mammals seem to be able to come back in really low numbers once they're protected. And in general, the ocean does seem to be very resilient to return, so that's a positive thing.
That is a positive thing. Well, thank you all so much for being here this evening, and we hope that you will join us for the next installment of our Ocean Science series in October. We will have Peggy Turk-Boyer, who's the executive director of SATO, and maybe Katrina can help me out. What does SATO stand for?
Oh, the Center for the Study of Deserts and Oceans.
Center for the Study of Deserts and Oceans, which is located in Rocky Point, but also has, I believe, offices in Tucson. And that is an organization that is dedicated to preserving the Sea of Cortez and the abundant life there. So that will be a fascinating talk. That's our nearby desert sea. I hope you'll join us, and thank you very much, and have a good evening.
And people who want to watch it, should we just play that video?
Yes, thank you for the reminder, because this is a fascinating video.
Unfortunately, this small Japanese pufferfish is dull, almost to the point of invisibility. But to compensate, he is probably nature's greatest artist. To grab a female's attention, he creates something that almost defies belief. His only tools are his fins. In his head, a plan of mathematical perfection. He ploughs the sand, breaking it up into the finest of particles. These shells aren't just rubbish to be removed. He uses them to decorate the bridges of his construction. He can't rest for more than a moment, but must work 24 hours a day for a week, or the current will destroy his creation. A final tidy up, and his masterpiece is complete. In nature does an animal construct something as complex and perfect as this. If this doesn't get him noticed, nothing will.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, and we hope to see you next month.